Welcome food fans, picky eaters, the flavor curious, and everyone in between. Nothing makes good food better than good conversation. And your table is ready. Come right this way to the Food For ThoughtCast with your host, Melissa Reagan. But you can call her Chef. All right, let's get this episode started.
As a chef and a person who loves all kinds of food, I'm always looking for ways that I can emphasize quality over quantity without feeling like I'm missing out or depriving myself of the things that I love. And I love pasta. Carbonara, mac and cheese, primavera, cacio e pepe, you name it and I'm all about it. That's why I choose Bonza. Bonza is the pasta made from chickpeas, which means it has more protein, more fiber, and I believe more flavor than regular old pasta. Seriously, if you go in my pantry right now, there are 2 boxes in there awaiting their next culinary adventure. Bonza has over 12 different kinds of pasta, including penne, rotini, elbows, and cavatappi, which is my favorite, because all of those curves and ridges hold even more delicious sauce. Bonza also makes pizza crust, which tastes too good to believe that it comes from peas. You can find Bonza at Whole Foods, Target, and Walmart. Hey there, food fans. Welcome back to the Food For ThoughtCast with me, your host, Melissa Reagan. As always, you can call me Chef. I hope you're having an amazing week so far. I'd like to bring you a 2-part episode about taste and flavor. This week, we're going to talk about the 5 different tastes. And next week, we're going to talk about how to build flavors and how to figure out what goes with what. So I hope you'll join me for the ride. So before we get started, I want to talk about the difference between what taste and flavor actually are. The difference between them is pretty simple. So taste refers specifically to the 5 basic tastes, which I'll share with you in a moment. These are the 5 specific tastes that science has determined that we can taste on our tongues. This is just one part of flavor. Flavor refers to the entire package. It's the whole package. It's taste, smell, chemical, and physical sensations that you have when you eat a specific food. So an example might be that a taste is salty, but that when you eat something like an oyster, you have the saltiness, you have the brininess that's attributed only to the ocean, you have the squeaky, soft yet firm texture, you might have the sound and the smell of the shell as it's approaching your nose and lips, and you might also have the chemical sensation of like a bit of a tingle or a little bit of a chill, right? If it's an oyster on the half shell and it's on ice. So I hope that makes sense. Guy Fieri likes to say that he is the mayor of Flavortown. I would like to propose to you that if Guy Fieri is the mayor of Flavortown, then I am the deputy sheriff of like unincorporated Flavor County, where we have all the same things as Flavortown, but I pay less taxes. The 5 tastes, what are they? Where do they come from? So there are 4 different zones of taste buds on your tongue where you can taste, and there is a 5th sensation that is referred to also as a taste. So these are bitter, salty, sweet, sour, and umami. Umami, I know that sounds weird. U-M-A-M-I. If you've never heard that, great. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later in this episode. When chefs attend culinary school, they are often taught that there are 4 quadrants of flavor. It kind of looks like a plus sign, and that all food should hit the middle of that plus sign. And that is to say that all items, right, that are prepared, not individual ingredients, but like all dishes, in other words, should hit all 4 quadrants somewhere along the way, science decided that, there's actually 5 different taste ants or basic tastes that the tongue can determine. But this quadrant method is a really easy way to teach people, right? That you've got to aim for the middle of this plus sign, with those 4 ends of the plus sign being bitter, salty, sweet, sour. And if you aim for the middle, that is to say that if every dish has a little bit of each component in the right measure, that the taste will be completely balanced. Now, sometimes this makes sense and sometimes it doesn't, right? There's dishes that are supposed to be all the way spicy. Think about Sichuan cooking, for example. You might not have bitter and sweet in every single dish. And then think about cookies. You're not going to have salty or sour in every single cookie recipe, right? But the idea is that if a dish is missing something, you should be able to determine which of the 4 or 5 it has and see what you can add or what is missing when you're creating layers of flavor, right? When you're cooking. And this also helps just determining what your personal tastes are. And by taste in that sentence, I mean preferences, right? But it really helps to be able to taste something. You can develop your palate and you'll be more easily able to determine, yes, I like that because A, B, and C, or no, I don't like this because A, B, and C. And it can help you form an educated opinion about food, if that's something you wish to do. Also, sometimes I eat things because they're fun to eat. Also, sometimes I like foods because they're, squeaky, like cucumbers. It's the sound they make inside your head. I know I'm a little bit weird, but that's fine, because if you've listened to the podcast thus far, you already know this about me. So I really have no problem confirming for you that I'm a little bit weird and a little bit different, but I'm unique and hopefully have endeared myself to you. If you've been listening since episode 1, I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much for listening and for sticking by me in this Food for ThoughtCast journey. I would like to start with one of the first tastes, which is sweet. So I want to talk about like how things taste sweet. What determines how sweet something is? Well, a lot of times the Maillard reaction will determine how sweet something is. Remember, all the way back in episode 1, the Maillard reaction happens when we cook or sear the outside of foods and causing them to caramelize or brown. So a really good example is grill marks on a steak, a really nice sear on a pan-seared item, or caramelized onions, for instance. All of these things make a sweet flavor, right? And then the other things that affect how sweet a food is sugar, obviously, but that's going to be natural included sugars or sugars that we add afterwards. So what things are sweet naturally? Well, there's sugar in all its forms, right? There's sugar cane, and then there are all the secondary forms of sugar that could be maple syrup, it could be molasses, it could be corn syrup, it could be honey. And then, you have liquid and dry forms of artificial sweeteners that have been created, right? Aspartame, stevia, sucralose, which is also known as Splenda, monk fruit, or the sugar alcohols group that you might see marketed as like keto sweetener. And those come in various liquid and dry forms. And then you have naturally sweet foods. These are going to be foods that have naturally occurring glucose and sucrose and fructose. So fructose, you can kind of hear it from the name, is more prevalent in fruit. And other vegetables or other items, maybe due to their carbohydrate count or other types of natural sugars, right, are going to taste sweet, or they're going to make our brain think that they're more sweet. And this includes things like beets, onions, like a sweet onion, like the 1015s that we get here in the South, like the sweeter yellow onion, carrots. Cabbage has natural sweetness. Potato has natural sweetness. And that's a byproduct of your brain assessing the amount of starch and what happens when that starch is like affected by a moisture. So when you bake a potato and that starch becomes fluffy and like swollen and starts kind of exploding in and on itself, right? Or you're boiling a potato or you've mashed it, it has a little bit of natural sweetness, but it's not something that we would equate with like a sweet or dessert. But then also you have obviously a sweet potato, which can taste like candy at the right level of ripeness. You have things like butternut squash, and then obviously you have all your fruits, right? And then there are all these other factors that affect how sweet something is perceived by our taste buds. So this includes artificial coloring. You can think about how, like when we make sugar water for hummingbirds and we put red food coloring in it, which I know is a huge no-no, but this is actually a really great example, because if you're looking at a glass of water, for instance, and somebody tells you that it is a sweet beverage, your brain is not going to make that connection as easily as if somebody sits a cup of red Kool-Aid in front of you. You're going to equate the colors red, orange, and pink with being sweeter. These are considered the warmer colors, and our brain makes the connection that they're naturally sweeter. This is one reason why peppermints are colored red and white. It's by design. They actually first they look festive, right? Next, they look Christmas related. But the third reason is because there's a little bit of science in there that a red and white peppermint is going to look more appealing on a psychological level than just a regular white mint, right? Or those pastel colored mints that you eat at weddings and Easter and baby showers and things like that. Those are super appealing colors for things that are sweetened like candy, right? Pastels, very inviting colors. And then you have spices that can make things seem more sweet. It affects our perception about how sweet they are. So when we talk about warming colors, we also talk about warming spices. So the warming spices that we associate with being warm or making food seem sweeter are cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, allspice, mace, cardamom, and star anise. And all of those things you might find in gingerbread, pumpkin spice, apple spice, pies, and cakes, right? And so you're going to be finding all of these warming spices in the desserts that we enjoy in the winter. And all of those things on your tongue are going to attribute to the feeling that something is actually sweeter than it is. A really good example of this is vanilla. So chocolate on its own is extremely bitter, one of those other five, right? But vanilla has enough sweetness in it that it makes us perceive that the chocolate is actually sweeter than it is. Now, do they add sugar to chocolate to make it sweet? 100% yes. But vanilla brings out that natural sweetness that's in chocolate. Now, if you use something like citric acid or different acids like vinegar, lemon, or lime juice, these things can stunt sweetness in other items, right? The citric acid is what tells your brain to pucker, basically. The citric acid in citrus fruits, for example, like lemons and limes, is that natural sour indicator. It's also used in a powder form as a fruit preservative. It also just dulls the sweetness of other foods. So you can tell that when citric acid is added to fruits to preserve them, for example, like if you got a bunch of strawberries, a really good deal on them at the farmer's market, and you were like, I can't eat all these in time, I'm going to use a little Fruit Fresh. Fruit Fresh is a product that is sold by the canning supplies. You might have seen your grandmother use it when you were little. You can sprinkle this on the fruit. It's a mixture of citric acid and a couple of other different food-safe chemicals that we're using to do exactly what the title says, keep the fruit fresher for longer. So you sprinkle this on your fruit so that it doesn't lose all of its luster when you freeze it. But it also dulls the sweetness of a fresh berry just a little bit. Some things that wake that sweetness back up are heat. Foods are going to taste different, in terms of how sweet they are at different temperatures. So I don't know if you've ever let ice cream or a milkshake melt, whether on purpose or an accident, but melted ice cream tastes nearly 5 times sweeter than the cold ice cream. And the reason for this is that the frozen and colder foods are actually going to stunt your taste buds just a bit. So they have to be flavored more strongly, and they have to be extremely sweet to survive that process of freezing or keeping things chilled. Like if you made Jell-O and you didn't let it set up all the way and you tasted it just as liquid, it would taste extremely syrupy and very sweet. And that's because your brain's going to react to it differently once it's chilled. It's the same thing with fruits. Different stages of ripeness will determine the amount of sugar that's present in berries and melons, for example, it's going to not only change the way that they taste, like a ripe raspberry versus an unripe raspberry, or a very ripe watermelon versus an unripe watermelon. You can taste the differences. You're going to perceive that it's less juicy. In some chances, it might actually, or in some cases rather, it might actually be less juicy because it's less ripe, but you're also going to perceive it as being less fresh, less flavorful, and it's actually going to be less sweet, not only on your tongue, but the perception in your brain when your tongue makes the connection with your taste buds. There's a chemical compound called lactosol that is produced by the Domino Sugar Company, and it's used in jellies, jams, and preserves to bring out the flavor of the fruit so that the company can get away, or rather, the companies that make the fruit preserves, jams, and jellies can get away with buying fruit that's a little less ripe and a little cheaper, and they can add this chemically produced sweetener, lactosol. It's a compound, it's real, purpose. It wasn't created to sweeten things, but it was created to make things taste more like themselves. So, for example, it makes grape jelly taste more grape-esque, grape-like, grape-ish. I don't know if any of those is actually like an appropriate term, but it is now. And it suppresses the sweet flavor so that your brain isn't just going, yum, sugar, yum, this is sweet, yum, this tastes like syrup. You're actually going to go like, these taste like the sweetest grapes I've ever had in my life. So it's a little bit of creative marketing and a little bit of food chemistry happening there. The next taste I want to talk about is sour. The Cambridge Dictionary defines sour as having a sharp, sometimes unpleasant taste or smell like a lemon, not sweet, it says. So interesting that it would use a lemon as an example. It's probably the most accessible and easy to understand example we have of what is sour. It indicates the presence of an acid. It says sometimes unpleasant in the Cambridge Dictionary definition. And that's because I don't know if you've ever heard the claim or like the explanation for why some people don't like cilantro is that they're genetically positioned to not like cilantro, right? It actually works this way with flavors as well. You can make yourself like a flavor that you don't like, but you are exercising an extraordinary amount of mind over matter. Like I trained myself to like unsweet tea, and because I drank tea continuously with lower and no amounts of sugar in it, I was having to get used to the actual, acidic and tannic taste of tea. Tea is made obviously from tea leaves. It has a great amount of tannins. Tannins are the substance in tea and wine that kind of like makes your mouth pucker after you drink it. It's that dryness that we taste when we taste wine, and you taste it in strong teas. So something like a white leaf green tea is going to have a very low tannin count, and something like black tea or orange pico, which is usually used for iced tea blends, is going to have a high tannin count. It can also contribute to that bitterness that we taste, right, in unsweetened teas. Well, I had to make myself like that because I'm quite sure that in my genetics somewhere, people really prefer things that are sweet, although I'm not sure, because also I like things that are salty. And then if you've listened to the show at all more than, one or two times, you know that I also like salty sweet. These are all things that can have genetic markers. So when we're talking about sour, it can be naturally occurring acids in food in nature, like citric acid is naturally occurring in lemons or limes, or it can be a different kind of acid called lactic acid. Lactic acid occurs usually in foods that are fermented. So this will be things like buttermilk, sour cream, sauerkraut, Korea's sauerkraut cousin, which is kimchi, which is delicious, that most people think is just hot, but it is sour and bubbly and fermented with lactic acid way before the spice is ever a factor, right? Vinegars, lactic acid is actually, the mechanism by which this fermentation happens. The things get sour. They go off just a little bit. It's basically us controlling the spoilage of food in a very scientific way, or not scientific, right? Sourdough, it's really a crapshoot. Somebody figured out that if they left flour and water out for a certain amount of time, the stars aligned just correctly, the temperature was just right, the wild yeast in the air would help it ferment to where it could make dough rise. That's also lactic acid. Lactic acid is not always the only acid that acts as the mechanism in these fermentation processes, but it is the most common and it's the most easily recognized. And then citrus fruits like calamansi, lemon, lime, grapefruit, kumquats, pomelos, and oranges have citric acid. And then you find a different kind of acid in a couple of other fruits that you might find sour or tart. And it's really easy to remember because the word tart is in the name. So what makes these specific fruits taste sour is tartaric acid. Cranberries, gooseberries, tart cherries, tamarind, and unripe grapes all have tartaric acid. And it's really that sensation, right? That all the moisture has been sucked out of your mouth. That's what this kind of acid does when you eat a fresh cranberry, which we don't really get the opportunity to eat a fresh cranberry in Texas, very often. And when we do get our hands on fresh cranberries, we add mountains of sugar to take this very unpleasant mouth puckering sensation away, right? We buy the bagged cranberries, sometimes fresh in the produce section around Thanksgiving, and you have to add so much sugar, and it's because they have high amounts of tartaric acid. And there's another fruit. We use it as a fruit, but botanically it is not a fruit, called rhubarb, right? That makes amazing pie, but it actually has a different kind of acid, and it's pretty interesting. It actually contains oxalic acid. And oxalic acid is the same thing that makes onions spicy when you eat them raw. It's also the same thing that can make onions smell incredibly pungent. It makes rhubarb as tart as it is, right? So whether things appear tart to you or sour, tart is something that would be more like a flavor that is perceived with all the senses, right? You crinkle your nose, you scrunch your face, you start to salivate. You feel that sour feeling in the back of your mouth. Your lips might tingle. Your mouth might become dry, right? Whereas sour is very much the taste itself on your tongue. All of these items are considered in the family of sour. Now, something like fat balances out sour. So think of it this way. If you're making salad dressing, a fat like olive oil or avocado oil or grapeseed oil or canola oil, whatever oil that you choose to use, safflower, sunflower, corn oil, whatever you're using in a salad dressing, right? If you go 3 parts vinegar to 1 part oil, which is kind of backwards in a classic vinaigrette ratio, then it's going to be extremely tart. And then the more fat you use, you're going to taste that fat and it's going to dull the sense of the sour on your tongue because think about it, fat coats the inside of your mouth. So it really makes a lot of sense. The next flavor I want to talk about is salt or salty. So good old table salt is described as salty. You know the one, it's the iodized salt and it's got the girl with the umbrella on the can, right? We've all had it. We've all seen it. It comes in regular salt shakers, out in the wild in restaurants. But what you're actually experiencing when you taste salt by itself is not the experience of it being salty, but it's what's known as salinity, which is like the relative amount of salt in something like seawater or ocean water, for instance. So salt is not a flavor by itself, but it acts as a flavor enhancer, partly because it makes foods taste more like themselves. It's like the world's vanilla to all the rest of the world's chocolate. In other words, salt makes foods taste more like themselves. It's going to make a beef taste more beefy. It's going to make tomatoes taste more tomatoey. It's going to make things that come out of the sea taste more like the sea. And that brings up a really good point, is that one type of salt is sea salt. Obviously, it's going to have a different flavor and texture than other kinds of salt. Iodized salt is going to taste a little bit chemically. It does have a metallic aftertaste. Now, I'm not here to be a salt snob and tell you that you have to use Himalayan pink salt or coarse kosher salt or Malden sea salt or flaked sea salt from Brittany, France, or anything like that, right? I have a lot of different kinds of salt, and I appreciate them all for the different roles that they play. And so I'm not here to pass judgment on your salt. 5 to 10,000 years ago, it's believed that virtually every society that has been in existence has utilized salt in a culinary way, which I think is amazing and mind-blowing. One of the first ways that it was utilized in a culinary sense, right, was preserving food. People figured out that if you salted pork, if you salted beef, if you salted cod, et cetera, it preserved it and it didn't go bad. And this was thousands of years before the advent of, ice houses, refrigeration, and modern day preservation, and even not so modern day preservation like canning, right? This predates canning, and it is incredible as a preservative. And not only that, but your body needs sodium to exist. So there are foods that can be salty on their own and reduce the need for added salt. Some examples of that are mustards, certain kinds of vinegars, fresh herbs, capers, Parmesan cheese, feta cheese, and ricotta salata, which salata actually means salty, or it has its origins in the word salt. In other words, right? Not only does it make food taste more like itself, salt, but these natural foods can kind of act in place of salt. So it's not that these foods I just listed are salt substitutes, in other words, but you have to be careful when you're using them in recipes, because you don't want to turn around and add salt after you've added these foods and then make it too salty. Then you won't be able to enjoy your dish. There are a few wives' tale urban myths about how to remove salt from a dish that's really too salty. We'll talk about which ones work and which ones don't. Salt enhances sweetness. It can change the perception of how thick something is. A good example of this is soup. So the relative salt content of a liquid changes the density of it, not necessarily in a physical way, but also in a physical way, right? Like if you think about the Dead Sea, people can float in it because it has so much salt in it that it makes things that are usually not buoyant. But also in a food sense, the percent of salt in a solution, we'll call it like a brine or a meat marinade, or like a broth or a soup or a stew, changes your perception of how thick it is. It just feels different on the tongue, right? And then it can mask metallic or chemical flavors in some instances. Now, if you've oversalted something, you can sometimes use an acid to counteract it, and you can also use a fat to counteract it. So if you salted a cream sauce too far, right? If you were making maybe, let's say, macaroni and cheese, you could add a very non-salty cheese. Like you could add some more of it, like maybe American cheese or Jack cheese, things that are a little bit less sharp and more mellow, or cream cheese rather, or unflavored yogurt would probably be a good remedy to like an over salty cheese sauce. But then, of course, you can also use a fat, which in some instances, right, like the solutions that I listed could be both. So you could consider cream cheese a fat. I mean, if we're really going there. But butter is probably the easiest way to counteract saltiness in something that's butter or dairy based. Now, the old potato trick, right? Like cutting up potatoes and throwing them into a soup. The thinking here is that the potato starch will absorb excess salt, but that's not really what's happening, because if that were the case, if you, let's say we're making beef vegetable soup and you tasted it and you got a little carried away with the salt and it got too salty, or you put something, else in it that was salty that is not just regular salt, like soy sauce, and you're trying to reel it back in, it's just past the threshold of tasting amazing, right? Like there really is this threshold of like how pleasurable a food is when you've seasoned it just right. And then there's a couple steps too far to where it kind of makes your tongue tingle and it's just too much salt to be enjoyable. That's the way that I prefer my popcorn, but there's not much other things in life that I prefer so salty that it's nearly painful, to a detriment, right, to eat. But if this were really the case, right, if potatoes and the starch in potatoes, like there's this old, method, right? It says if you've oversalted a soup, you can cut up potatoes and add them in. If they really absorbed all the salt out of the soup, what would happen is you would be left with these super over salty chunks of potatoes. And that's just not really how it works, because salt and water are always trying to equalize with each other. So the potatoes do absorb the salt, but they can really only hold so much. It's like our bodies. We can only hold onto so much sodium at a time. Our kidneys do a really good job of flushing the excess sodium out, which is also one reason why, hydration is so important. But what the potatoes do in the soup to solve the problem is they stretch the dish out. So another really good solution, right? If you've made something that's too salty, you can just double the recipe or kind of make another 1 times of the recipe, which seems impractical at times. But honestly, if it's something that you've oversalted, like a cold salad or, a soup, you can just add a few more of the actual ingredients to it without adjusting the seasoning. Once again, what you're doing is you're stretching it, you're expanding it, and this will probably help it be less salty. Apart from that, once you've taken a dish past the brink of being too salty, there's not a ton of things you can do that you can add that are magic, but you can dilute the flavors, right? If it's a soup, you can add more unsalted broth or milk or cream, depending on the kind of soup, right? Whatever makes sense in your instance, or even water, depending on what it is. If you've oversalted a cold salad, for example, you can add more of the base, like mayonnaise or cream cheese or yogurt or whatever you've used, right? If you've oversalted guacamole, okay, add some more avocados. Just think about it in terms of what ingredient is already in this recipe. What ingredient is already in here that I can add that makes sense, or really how you can prevent this is a little bit of salt and then taste it, and a little bit more salt and then taste it again, right? Because they always say you could put some more in, but you can't take it out. And it's extremely true. So the next taste I want to talk about is bitter. Bitter is the most unpopular of the 5 taste ants, right? The 5 things that we can taste. There's actually evolutionary reason for this, because things that are naturally bitter in nature can sometimes be poisonous. Not necessarily to us, but it's that predator-prey thing, right? Like butterflies are super, brightly colored and appealing to some birds, but they're super bitter and don't taste great, and it acts as a deterrent. And so there's a couple of things that are bitter when we eat them raw. That means we have to process it or cook it differently, but they would have been a deterrent in the olden days because they could have been things that could make us sick without the proper culinary skills. I know that sounds like crazy and far-fetched, but basically there's a reason that we're wired not to like bitter flavors, and certain people are genetically bound to like these more than others. The best example of this is IPAs. IPAs have more hops than other types of beer, and they are not only are they an acquired taste, but they're a preference. So some other fruits where this is really prevalent, as some other foods rather, there's grapefruit, collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, kale, Swiss chard, rainbow chard, dark chocolate, which is really the absence of fat and sugar that's been added during the processing, but cacao, for example, or cacao nibs, extremely bitter, like very, very bitter, like the darkest chocolate. Also eggplant. So bitter might be the most unpopular of the 5 tastes, but it is absolutely critical for balance. If you put too much sugar into processed grapefruit juice, it wouldn't taste good. Part of the kind of what makes grapefruit juice is delicious is all that balance. And it's a really great example. So if you think of a plus sign with sour at one side on your left, right? Sweet on the other, salty at the top, and bitter at the bottom, you can see that all 4 of those within something like grapefruit juice are absolutely necessary to make it delicious. If it's not sweet enough, it'll be too tart. If it's too tart, it'll taste too sour. If it's too sour, it'll lend itself more to bitter because sweetness can cut bitterness. And this is also a great example of salt on fruit can really bring out the desirable notes that we want. I know it sounds weird. Maybe some people didn't grow up that way, but it's worth trying sometime if you're curious, right, about how our foods are flavored naturally and how our foods, like how we perceive the flavors and taste in food, right? Salt on watermelon does make us perceive that it's sweeter, whether it's true or not. And it's because our body is searching for balance. So it's going to be balanced. So this is not propaganda for me liking salty and sweet together. It's actually true. If you have an extremely bitter grapefruit, a little sugar will help it taste more well-rounded, more balanced. Oh, I made a joke because it's round, because it's grapefruit. And then if it's more tart, a little salt might achieve the same thing, right? And so while bitter is one of the most unpopular flavors, it can be one of the most nuanced flavors. Like the bitterness of eggplant makes baba ganoush taste really great because we cut it with fat and acid, right? Like lemon juice, tahini, all of really good quality olive oil. The bitterness of hops makes amazing beers, right? And those spent hops and grains can be used to make really amazing bread. And the depth of that bread from the bitterness of those hops is really, really impressive. It gets like really deep flavors, kind of like what we associate with rye and pumpernickel, those really nuanced bread flavors. And then really bitter greens can be turned into something really amazing when you add fat, like bacon, and acid, like a little splash of vinegar, or hot sauce, or peppers and vinegar, like trappies. That's why it goes so well together, because your brain is trying to balance all of these flavors. Because while one place on your soft palate, the roof of your mouth, the back of your throat, and your tongue is designated for each taste, you are tasting it, right, with your entire mouth. And then the flavor is that entire experience. So your brain and your tongue is seeking to balance whatever the flavors are. It's really incredible. The fifth taste I want to talk about is umami. That's umami. This is the meatiness or the earthiness that comes from foods like soy sauce. So you think, well, hey, didn't you just say soy sauce was a salty taste? Yes, I did. But that salty taste comes from this earthiness, this richness, right? That is from the process of the soy sauce, like the brewing of this soybean, right? And the wheat that's present. Now, if you get tamari, it doesn't have wheat because it's gluten-free. Either one of them is a really great example of this taste. Mushrooms. Mushrooms get incredibly meaty when you cook them down. They lose all their water. That meaty flavor gets concentrated. Mushroom is a really good example of what umami is. Meat. Meat has an incredible umami taste. Things like tomato paste, when we talk about things that are rich and concentrated. Aged cheeses have that umami taste. Miso paste, if you've ever gone for Japanese food and had miso soup, this is a really great example of umami. So science determined, right, we have these four: bitter, sweet, salty, sour, and umami exists on its own plane somewhere. You taste that with your entire tongue. There's not specific zones, but it's really this, perception of depth, heaviness, and meatiness and richness that doesn't fit into any of these other categories. And a lot of umami is also produced by that Maillard reaction we talked about. Like when you brown meats, it makes this savory flavor that's really hard to describe, and it's hard to find in things, naturally occurring, except for the things that I mentioned on this list. Now, you can use any of those things to increase the umami of a dish. So I'm going to give you a really good example. You can add tomato paste to like an onion, celery, carrot mixture and let it caramelize further in the pan. What you're doing is you're browning the sugars that are present in the tomato paste. It's going to give a lot of depth to your pasta sauce, right? So umami is enhanced by salt, and you can stunt it with acid. So if you added more salt to soy sauce, it would obviously be salty, but you're deepening the richness of that flavor. But if you wanted to mellow it out or stunt it, you could add something like vinegar or lemon or lime juice. It's the same thing with mushrooms. Mushrooms are really delicious when you add just a little splash of acid at the end. And what it does is it just changes that kind of depth perception. And I don't mean distance, right? I don't mean like driving and I can't see the car in front of me. I mean like the mushrooms have a depth to their flavor that's a very savory, meaty depth. And that acid kind of lightens it and it really opens it up. So it stunts that savory, heavy flavor. The same thing for meat. It's like when we add pico de gallo, for example, to like, beef fajitas, it opens up different flavors of that beef. You have the fat from the sour cream, for instance, right? Like say we've gone to our favorite Mexican restaurant, we've ordered a fajitas platter. The steak fajitas, right? Delicious. It has that umami taste, that deep, heavy, beefy, meaty, the things that we associate with this, the savory flavors, right? Well, you get a bright punch of acid from the tomatoes and the lime juice and the pico de gallo. You get the balance from the fat in the sour cream. You get the sharpness of the cheddar cheese, right? You get the coolness of the guacamole. And that's when we get into the flavor realm. So you start with that base taste, right? Umami. And then you add all these different components to each tortilla, for example, and it builds a flavor. Now, whatever that flavor is to you, it's special, right? Because every, beef fajita taco, in other words, that you build in your hand, like a soft taco, is going to have a different balance. Maybe you don't like sour cream. Maybe you don't eat cheese. Maybe you don't eat dairy at all. Maybe you love pico. Maybe you love hot sauce. That's another thing. Like spicy, you noticed, is not in any of these, 5 tastes. But spicy's absolutely a flavor, and you can load something up with spicy to the point where you deaden your senses to be able to taste anything else. But you can also tip that scale so far that it produces endorphins. It's kind of like a runner's high you get without running, which is my favorite. And you basically get a high from eating something that's super duper hot, but then also you can't taste anything else. Spicy is another thing that benefits from acid, Little lime juice. It goes a really long way. You could bring the flavor, the entire experience, right? And the taste, salty, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, back to center by just tweaking one of those components in a spicy dish. What happens when you're out of balance with these tastes? Well, typically, if a dish tastes boring, it's usually missing an acid or spicy. If you can't taste the non-spicy components, you can mellow that with sweetness, sour, or fat. And then just beware that things that are alliums in the allium family, like garlic and onions, they have enzymes that can actually amplify heat. If you're going to use something that's sour, right, or something that's bright and acidic, like nice raw garlic in salsa, just be aware that it can amplify heat. It'll make it so spicy it's inedible. I've ruined a couple of hot sauces before. Just trust me on this one. And then other things that are considered naturally spicy or pungent or hot, see, it's kind of on the other side of the scale from bitter, but it's still not considered one of the 5 tastes. These would be like ginger, horseradish, or mustard. But what you're actually tasting is an overload of acidity and bitterness at 2 ends of the scale. So things like horseradish, super duper pungent, makes your mouth water, makes your nose run, right? But it's not one of the taste on its own spicy. It's just one of the 5 tastes that's way out of balance, but some people like it like that. So I hope that you found this interesting. I can't wait to bring you part 2 of how we're going to build flavors, how you know when to season, what to use for what, and what goes together. I can't tell you how many times I get the question as a chef, hey, how do you know what goes with what? Well, I've eaten a lot of terrible things and I've made a lot of mistakes. And I've made a lot of mistakes with my own money that I just had to suck it up and eat because that was the grocery budget. And I've tasted a lot of things and I love to eat. So you don't have to necessarily have an adventurous palate to know what you like, right? But I'm going to give you some simple guidelines about what goes with what, and we're going to look at spices and herbs and seasonings from around the world, and we're going to work on building flavors from the ground up so that you can A, feel less stressed in the kitchen, and B, maybe try something new. This has been the Food for ThoughtCast. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful week. That's a wrap for today. Until the next episode of the Food for ThoughtCast, make good food, eat good food, share it, and be kind to one another.
Thanks so much for listening today. You are part of what makes us special, and we are so glad you joined us. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. Just like food, delicious podcasts are better when you share them with others. Come back for seconds wherever podcasts are served, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Food for ThoughtCast.
You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at the Food for ThoughtCast or at www.foodforthoughtcast.com, where you can link to all podcast players, or you can send us an email at foodforthoughtcmc@gmail.com.